Hey everyone, welcome back to DarkVerse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, and tonight I'm going to share a chilling story that still haunts my friend to this day. It's called I Lived in a Haunted Hotel for One Night, and it's one of those experiences that's hard to believe, but when he told me about it, I could feel the terror in his voice. My friend thought he was just staying at a quiet, rundown hotel for a night, nothing more. But what he experienced there turned into something far darker and far more dangerous than he ever imagined. Trust me, after hearing this, you'll never think of a quiet hotel the same way again. So buckle up and let's dive into this unsettling journey together. I had been driving for hours, the only company the steady hum of the engine and the occasional glance at the rearview mirror. The road was long, winding through stretches of dark forest, with nothing but the occasional flicker of my headlights to illuminate the path ahead. My eyes were heavy, the exhaustion from the drive weighing on my body like a thick, suffocating blanket. I hadn't planned on stopping. Not yet. But as the night dragged on, the fatigue became unbearable. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and the hum of the car started to lull me into a trance-like state. That's when I saw it. In the distance, rising against the empty, starless sky, was a silhouette of a building. It was hard to tell at first. The way the moonlight barely kissed its jagged outline made it appear like something out of a nightmare, tall and looming, with a dark presence that sent a shiver down my spine. I had passed several small towns with inns or motels, but this was different. There was something about this place that felt off. Yet at that moment, I couldn't bring myself to care. I needed a bed, and this place, whatever it was the only option in sight. As I turned off the road and into the parking lot, the tires of my car rolling over the cracked pavement, I had the oddest feeling that the building had been waiting for me. The hotel's exterior was aged, with peeling paint and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. The sign above the door flickered sporadically, the words barely visible, Willowbrook Hotel. The name sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place why. It lingered at the back of my mind, like a memory just out of reach. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and stepped out, feeling the cool night air hit me like a cold slap to the face. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt an inexplicable pull to the building. The door creaked open as I approached it, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been oiled in years. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply and a chill ran through me. It was as if I had crossed into another world, one where the air was thicker, colder, and filled with an odd sense of foreboding. The lobby was dimly lit by a single, flickering chandelier, its light casting strange, distorted shadows along the walls. The wallpaper was a faded shade of burgundy, peeling at the edges, and the carpet beneath my feet was threadbare, its once rich color now a dull, lifeless shade of brown. There was a faint, musty smell in the air, like old wood, damp fabric, and something else I couldn't quite place. As I moved further into the lobby, I caught sight of the receptionist. She was an older woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her hair pulled back into a tight gray bun. She sat behind the front desk, her eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. Her smile was the first thing that struck me, wide and strange, as though it had been frozen in place for far too long. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft, almost too soft. "How may I assist you?" I hesitated for a moment, then forced a polite smile. "I'm looking for a room for the night." She didn't seem to blink, her eyes never leaving mine as she reached beneath the desk and pulled out a dusty key. "Room 307, she said, handing it to me. The key was heavy in my hand, its brass surface tarnished and worn. "Thank you," I said, glancing at the old wooden sign above the desk. "Room 307, third floor." She gave another slow, almost imperceptible nod, but as I turned to leave, I thought I heard her whisper something under her breath. "You'll be gone by morning, won't you?" I froze for a split second, my pulse quickening, but when I turned around to ask her what she meant, she was already gone, her chair now empty. Shrugging off the strange interaction, I made my way to the stairs. The hotel didn't have an elevator, and as I climbed each creaky step, I felt the weight of the building's age pressing down on me. The stairs seemed to stretch on longer than they should have, each step groaning beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. When I finally reached the third floor, I stood in front of room 307. The door was an aged wooden structure, its paint chipped and cracked. The brass handle cold to the touch gave a low squeak as I turned it. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was small but tidy. The bed was covered in an old floral quilt, its fabric faded and worn. The curtains, which hung heavily over the windows, were drawn tight, blocking out the faint light of the moon. The furniture, an armchair in the corner, a wooden dresser, a small desk, was old but functional. A cracked mirror hung above the dresser, reflecting the faint glow from the hallway light. As I placed my bag on the bed and unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt too still, too quiet. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if I wasn't alone. I quickly dismissed the thought. It was just exhaustion, nothing more. I went to the window and pulled the heavy curtains aside. Outside, the parking lot was bathed in moonlight, but the rest of the world beyond was cloaked in darkness. The trees that surrounded the hotel seemed to sway, though there was no wind. The longer I stared, the more the shadows seemed to shift, as if they were moving on their own. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. I couldn't get the strange sensation out of my mind, the feeling that something was watching me. The air felt colder now, heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I hurried to the bathroom to splash water on my face, but when I looked into the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. For a brief moment, my reflection flickered. Just a second, but enough to make me freeze. I stepped back from the mirror, my mind racing. Had I seen that correctly? Was I just imagining things? I didn't know, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I didn't have the energy to investigate further. I was too tired, too worn out from the long drive. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The seconds dragged on as I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the hotel. It was so silent, so still, that it felt unnatural. The silence was suffocating, as though it was waiting for something to break it. That's when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. At first I thought it might have been a mistake, a stray noise, the sound of the wind maybe. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate knock. I hesitated, my heart raced, and my mouth went dry. Who could it be? I didn't know anyone in the hotel, and I hadn't heard anyone come up to this floor. I slowly got out of bed, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. As I cracked it open, I found nothing. Just the empty, dimly lit hallway. But as I stepped back into the room, I saw something on the floor. A small, folded note. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was strange, slanted, uneven, as though written in a hurry. "Get out while you still can." I froze. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering in the distance, just beyond the walls. A low murmur, like voices calling out to me. I backed away from the door, the note still clutched in my hand, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was something wrong about this place. I needed to leave, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind me. The moment I walked into the hotel lobby, the air felt different. Thick, heavy. The kind of weight that presses on your chest, making it hard to breathe, even if you don't know why. My footsteps echoed off the worn hardwood floors, and I couldn't help but notice how the dim, flickering chandelier overhead cast strange shadows along the walls. The walls, with their faded wallpaper and water stains, seemed to breathe in and out, as if the building itself was alive. It didn't feel like a welcoming place, not at all, but I was too tired to care. I glanced around. The lobby was deserted except for one person, the receptionist. She was hunched behind the desk, her thin frame almost lost in the oversized chair. The skin on her face sagged with age, her deep wrinkles folding in on themselves as she looked at me. Her eyes a piercing, unsettling shade of gray. I couldn't explain it, but something about her gaze made me feel like she could see right through me, peeling back the layers I kept hidden. "Can I help you, dear?" Her voice was soft, too soft. It was almost as though she was speaking in hushed tones, as if she didn't want anyone to overhear. There was something in her tone that sent a shiver up my spine, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Yeah, I need a room for the night," I said, trying to sound calm despite the creeping unease building inside me. "I've been driving for hours and just need to rest." She didn't move at first, her hands resting on the desk, her fingers long and bony. Her gaze didn't leave mine, and I felt a strange hesitation in the air, as if she was evaluating me, making a decision. Her eyes flickered momentarily, just enough for me to notice. And then she reached down into a drawer and pulled out an old brass key. "Room 307, she said, her voice trailing off as she handed me the key. The key was unusually heavy for its size, the tarnished brass cool against my fingers. "Third floor, it's just down the hall." I took the key without thinking, my hand brushing against hers for a moment, and I couldn't help but notice how cold her skin was, like touching a piece of ice. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe thank her, but before I could speak, she leaned in closer to me, her eyes narrowing slightly. The air between us felt thick, and a sudden wave of dread washed over me, as if I'd crossed some invisible line. "You'll be gone by morning, won't you?" she whispered under her breath. I froze. My breath hitched in my chest, and my heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for her to say that. No reason at all. I stared at her, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "What do you mean by that?" I managed to ask, my voice a little shakier than I intended. But she only smiled, slowly, almost knowingly, and leaned back in her chair. The faintest trace of amusement played at the corners of her lips. "Nothing, dear. Just be careful." I couldn't quite process her words. I tried to shake off the feeling in my chest, but it wouldn't go away. My pulse was racing now and my stomach twisted into knots. I didn't know if it was the lack of sleep or something more, but the room felt colder. The silence between us stretched for too long. "Right," I said, my voice barely a whisper, as I turned away from the desk. I had to get out of there. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, but I forced myself to walk toward the stairs, clutching the key tightly in my hand. The lobby seemed to grow quieter as I moved, the faint murmurs of the outside world muffled by the thick walls. It felt like I was leaving the real world behind, stepping deeper into a place I wasn't supposed to be. The staircase creaked under my feet as I ascended, each step echoing in the silence. The wood beneath my shoes groaned as if protesting my presence. The second floor seemed to stretch on forever, the long hallway dimly lit by the flickering lights that overhead. My footsteps grew louder as I made my way to the third floor, each one a harsh sound against the oppressive stillness. Room 307. When I finally reached the door, I couldn't help but hesitate. The number on the door was faint, worn down from years of use, but the room itself looked normal enough from the outside, old but not exactly menacing. Still, there was an unnatural chill in the air, a weight, something that made me pause just for a moment before I pushed the door open. The room was small, nothing more than a basic bed, a dresser, and a small desk by the window. The wallpaper was faded, the floral patterns almost completely washed out by time. A heavy curtain was drawn over the window, blocking out the moonlight, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The floor creaked with each step, the sound almost oppressive, as if the hotel was groaning in its sleep. I placed my bag on the bed and looked around, the heavy silence pressing in around me. The room didn't feel like a place for rest. It felt like a holding cell. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me. I could almost hear the walls breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. I needed to shake off this feeling. I was just tired, that's all. The drive had gotten to me. I told myself that over and over, but the unease didn't go away. It dug into me like a splinter that couldn't be removed. I went to the bathroom to freshen up, but when I turned on the light, the bulb flickered. I caught my reflection in the mirror and froze. My face looked pale, drawn, almost too tired to recognize. There was something wrong with my eyes, bloodshot and wide, like I hadn't slept in days. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the haze in my mind. When I wiped my face with a towel, the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. For a brief second, it was someone else's. Someone with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted grin. But then it was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked again, it was just me. But the air around me seemed to shimmer, like something was moving just beneath the surface of the reflection, waiting to break through. I turned away quickly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wasn't imagining things. The hotel felt wrong, wrong in a way that was beyond explanation. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating me, as though it had been alive for far longer than I could understand. I decided to go to bed early. There was nothing more to do here, no point in staying awake, and letting my mind wander further down that dark path. I could worry about it in the morning, but as I lay in the bed, the covers pulled tightly around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the walls, breathing in the shadows. It was quiet at first, a slow, soft sound that I almost thought was my imagination. But then it came again. A tap, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my breath catch. I held perfectly still, straining to hear. Nothing. The knock stopped. But then, in the silence that followed, something strange happened. The room felt colder, unnaturally cold. The air around me thickened, like something was pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear a faint whispering from somewhere deep within the hotel. It was distant, echoing through the walls, but it sounded familiar. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. A steady murmur like an old lullaby, singing just below the threshold of hearing. And then I heard it again. A tap, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. This time I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen, rooted to the bed by an invisible force. The sound was getting closer, more insistent, like something or someone was waiting for me to answer. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. The room grew colder still, the air thick with dread. The whispering grew louder, closer. My breath came in ragged gasps, the only sound I could hear in the stillness of the night. And then, as if the world itself was holding its breath, the knock came again. Only this time it wasn't at the door, it was right behind me. The hallway stretched out before me, narrow and suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in. It felt too long for such an old, forgotten hotel. Each step I took seemed to echo louder than the last, my feet sinking into the worn carpet that was fraying at the edges. The light overhead flickered every few seconds, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper, which curled at the edges like it had been abandoned for decades. The faded floral pattern on the walls looked almost ancient, worn by time and neglect. I couldn't help but notice the strange smell in the air, musty, damp, with an undertone of something metallic, like rusted iron. I should have felt at ease, but the deeper I walked into the hallway, the more unsettled I became. My footsteps echoed through the quiet, each creak of the floorboards beneath me reverberating in my chest. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, and I found myself straining to listen for any sounds from the other rooms. I had already passed several doors on either side, but there was no sign of life, no sound, no movement. Just the weight of that silence, pressing down on me from all sides. I quickened my pace, feeling the air grow heavier around me, the temperature dropping inexplicably with each step. The chill was unnatural, not the kind of cold you feel when a draft slips through a crack, but something more sinister. It crept under my skin, cold and alive, as though the building itself were trying to freeze me in place. My breath came out in small, shallow puffs, visible in the dim light above me. The hall stretched on longer than it should have. My mind tried to make sense of it, rationalize it somehow. Maybe the hallway was just built like this, long and narrow, with no other exits. But it didn't feel like it. It didn't feel like any ordinary hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was stretching endlessly, its walls somehow shifting, pulling me deeper inside. I tried to push those thoughts out of my head, but the more I walked, the heavier the sense of being watched became. It wasn't just a vague discomfort, it was a full-on sensation, like eyes were pricking at my back. I turned my head sharply, scanning the space behind me, but there was nothing. The hallway was as empty as it had been when I first stepped onto it. Yet I couldn't rid myself of the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was following me. I paused for a moment, standing in the middle of the hallway, trying to force myself to breathe evenly. This was just exhaustion, I told myself. I'd driven too long, been awake too long. I needed a rest, to shut my eyes for just a few hours and forget about the unease that was slowly eating at my mind. I glanced at the door to my left, wondering if I should knock, ask if there was anyone else staying in the hotel. But before I could move, the temperature dropped again. The air seemed to twist, thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I shivered involuntarily, rubbing my arms to ward off the chill. That's when it happened. A loud slam echoed down the hallway. The sound came from the far end, a door slamming shut as though something, or someone, had been in the room, and it was now gone. My heart lurched in my chest, and instinctively I froze. I was sure no one had been there before. I had been walking for minutes, and I hadn't seen or heard a single thing. Yet now, someone, had just made its presence known. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a sudden surge of panic flood my chest. I glanced over my shoulder quickly, as if to check that I wasn't being followed, but the hallway behind me was still empty. I tried to shake off the rising anxiety, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, only grew stronger. My muscles tensed with the creeping dread that settled in my bones. I stepped forward again, determined to make it to my room and lock the door behind me. But my steps faltered when I noticed the door at the far end of the hall. It had opened, just a crack. I hadn't seen it open, had I? The door had been firmly closed earlier when I passed it, and now it was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The thought of checking it, of going any closer, filled me with a cold sense of dread that tightened my throat. But something compelled me to move. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, a force I couldn't name, that urged me to go towards it. I took a tentative step forward. The hallway seemed even longer now, stretching out endlessly as the door beckoned me closer. The dim lights overhead flickered again, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to follow my every move. The walls closed in around me, and I felt the temperature drop even further, the air growing denser with each passing second. My breath was shallow, coming in quick bursts as I moved slowly, almost unwillingly, toward the door. As I approached the crack in the door, I could feel something pulling at me, like an invisible string tugging me forward. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the cold metal. The moment my hand touched it, a sudden gust of wind swept through the hallway, making the flickering light overhead blink out completely, leaving the entire hallway in complete darkness. I stood there frozen, the handle still in my grasp. The silence was absolute now, suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. The darkness ahead of me felt thick, almost tangible, like it was swallowing the light around it. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable, the sound of shuffling footsteps, the kind of shuffle that only happens when something, was moving slowly, dragging their feet, taking each step with purpose. It came from beyond the door, muffled but growing louder. Closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The steps continued slow and deliberate, like someone or something was approaching. I wanted to turn and run, to flee back down the hallway, but my body refused to respond. The fear that gripped me was paralyzing, locking my legs in place. The door creaked open slightly wider, as if pushed from the other side. I could feel the cold air spilling out, a gust that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse, a living, breathing thing that pulled at me with an invisible force. And then, just as I was about to tear my gaze away and sprint down the hallway, the sound stopped. Completely. For a moment, everything was still. I stood in the darkened hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, sweat beading on my forehead. I was sure I could hear my own breath, ragged and too loud in the silence. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus on the door, but the shadows beyond it seemed to grow thicker, almost alive, twisting and shifting with every second. My hand still clutched the door handle, my knuckles white with the pressure. But then, with a final, terrifying creak, the door swung open fully. And there, in the pitch-black space beyond it, I saw it. A pair of eyes, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakable. Two glowing pinpricks of light staring at me, watching me. And then, the unmistakable sound of a breath. A slow, ragged exhale echoed from the darkness, right before the door slammed shut with such force that the hallway shook. My heart nearly stopped. The air around me grew still again, and the silence pressed down harder than ever before. And that's when I knew. There was something in this hotel, something in that room, and it had been waiting for me. I opened the door to room 307 and immediately felt the weight of the air pressing in on me. It was an old room, the kind you expect from a budget motel. Worn carpets, cracked wallpaper, and a faint musty smell that clung to the furniture like an old memory. There was nothing particularly unusual about it at first glance. The bed was small, unremarkable, its floral patterned comforter faded from years of use. The dresser was a pale wood, chipped in places, and there was a heavy curtain drawn over the window, blocking out any natural light. A single lamp in the corner flickered, its yellowish glow casting an eerie light over the room. I stepped inside, my suitcase in hand, and instantly felt a subtle unease settle over me. It wasn't the room itself. It was the feeling that something didn't quite belong here, that something was off in a way I couldn't explain. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if it was too stale to breathe properly. It hung in the room like a weight, filling my lungs and making my movements feel sluggish, like I was wading through fog. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the exhaustion from the long drive catching up with me. I was tired, bone-deep tired, and I needed sleep more than anything. The last thing I wanted was to spiral into an irrational fear. The room wasn't that bad, really. It was just an old hotel, and I was being silly. Nothing more. I tossed my bag onto the bed, the mattress giving a soft, almost hollow creak as I sat down. The bed sagged in the middle, unnaturally so, as if it had been slept in too many times and was now permanently shaped by someone else's body. I tried to ignore the way it made my skin prickle, and I leaned back against the pillows, trying to find comfort in the space. But no matter how I adjusted, it didn't feel right. The weight of the bed shifted with each move I made, and the room seemed to grow heavier with every second I spent in it. My eyes drifted across the room, taking in the faint cracks, in the walls and the peeling wallpaper, but they kept returning to the dresser across from me. There, just to the right of the bed, stood an old mirror, cracked in the corner. It was small, probably something from a yard sale, but it caught my attention in a way I couldn't explain. I stood up and walked over to it, the floorboards creaking with each step. As I approached, I noticed the way the glass seemed to shimmer faintly, distorting the reflections of the room. The cracks in the mirror made the reflection look jagged, as if something were trying to break through, and I felt a strange pull to it. I leaned in closer, studying the reflection of myself staring back at me. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. It was just me, my tired face, and the flickering light from the lamp behind me casting long shadows across the room. But then, for a brief moment, my reflection seemed off. It flickered. The edges of my reflection wavered like a faulty TV signal, and for just a split second, the image didn't seem to match my movements. My reflection, myself, paused, then continued moving as if it had caught up to the real me. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. It was just exhaustion, I told myself. Maybe the light is playing tricks on me. But that moment, just that fleeting second, lingered in my mind, refusing to let go. I turned my gaze back to the mirror, half expecting to see it again, but it was still just me. Nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned away, walking quickly to the suitcase I had tossed onto the bed. I needed to focus on something normal, something I could control. I opened the suitcase and began to unpack, pulling out clothes and toiletries, trying to busy my hands to give my mind something to latch onto. But it was hard to ignore the air around me. It felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close around me. The longer I stayed in the room, the shadows in the corners growing darker, more oppressive. I kept telling myself it was the exhaustion, the lack of sleep. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was trapped in some strange liminal space where time didn't quite make sense. The room felt like it didn't belong in this world. It felt like a place forgotten by time, a place where things could hide in the shadows and slip through the cracks. I glanced at the mirror again, and this time, I couldn't help but notice how the cracks in the glass seemed to pulse, just slightly, as though the glass itself was breathing. I turned quickly away from it, feeling a surge of panic rise in my chest. The mirror was nothing more than a piece of old furniture, I told myself. But why did it feel like it was more than that? I tried to push the thought aside and forced myself to focus on unpacking, but my mind kept circling back to the mirror, like a fly trapped in a web. I took a deep breath and turned to the window, hoping the sight of the outside world would help ground me. But when I pulled the curtains open, all I saw was darkness, a thick, impenetrable blackness that seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows outside seeming just as alive as the ones inside the room. I couldn't even make out the outline of the hotel parking lot. It was as though the night had swallowed the world whole. I closed the curtains quickly, my heart beginning to race. The room felt smaller now, the walls drawing closer together. It wasn't just the physical space. It was something more insidious, something unseen that weighed on me like a hand around my throat. I felt trapped in this place, like the room had swallowed me whole, and the longer I stayed, the harder it became to tell what was real and what wasn't. I grabbed my bag and went to the bathroom, hoping that a cold splash of water on my face would clear my head. But when I turned on the sink, the water came out in a trickle, sputtering as if the pipes hadn't been used in years. I watched, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach, as the water barely dribbled out, pooling slowly in the sink. I splashed my face, rubbing my eyes in an attempt to shake off the exhaustion. When I looked up again, the mirror above the sink was reflecting not just my face, but something else. Something I couldn't explain. There was a figure behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a split second, I thought it was just my imagination. A trick of the tired mind. But the figure was unmistakable, a dark silhouette standing just beyond the doorway. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the room behind me was empty. The door was closed, the space just as I had left it. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure was gone. But there was something else, a strange distortion, a flicker, just like what I had seen earlier. The reflection wasn't quite mine anymore. My face looked different, more hollow, like the tiredness had taken on a physical form. But it wasn't just my face. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine. They were darker, sunken, filled with something I couldn't name, something empty. I stumbled backward, my hand instinctively reaching for the door, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection of me, the real me, was still staring back at me, but there was something wrong about it. The cracks in the mirror seemed to deepen, spreading like a web of jagged lines, as if the glass itself was breaking apart to reveal something far worse beneath. A soft, low sound, like a whisper, came from behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding. But again, there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the same empty room, the same oppressive silence. I had to leave. The room felt alive, the walls pressing in, suffocating me. The longer I stayed, the more the feeling of something watching me grew. Something was in this room, something I couldn't see but could feel, lurking just behind my peripheral vision, hiding in the shadows of the cracked mirror. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But when I turned to the door, I found it shut tight. No way out. I was trapped. Around midnight, the knock came. It was soft at first, barely more than a tap, a light rapping against the wood of the door, but it repeated itself. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone testing the silence of the night. I froze, my body stiffening as I turned toward the door, my heart beating faster, though I didn't know why. The hallway outside my room was dark, and the air felt thick, weighed down with an uncomfortable stillness that made every breath feel shallow. The knock came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable. I sat there for a moment, staring at the door, unsure of what to do. The hotel had been completely empty when I checked in, or at least that's what the receptionist had said. The eerie woman who had handed me the key had made a point to mention how quiet it was, how the hotel was mostly unoccupied, especially at night. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since I'd arrived. The stillness of the place, the absence of life, should have been a relief, but instead it gnawed at my nerves. Who could be knocking? I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe the wind, maybe the house settling. But as the knocks continued, a creeping dread began to settle deep in my stomach. It wasn't natural. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. It felt like someone was waiting for me to react. I glanced over at the window, the heavy curtains drawn tight, blocking out the night. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, unnaturally thickening in the corners, like they were closing in on me. I stood up from the bed, my legs feeling stiff beneath me. The room seemed colder now, the temperature having dropped in the last few minutes. I didn't know if it was just my nerves or something more sinister at play, but the air felt thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I grasped the cold metal. The knocks came again, 3 more taps, each one harder than the last. My hand tightened on the knob and I turned it slowly, as though expecting something to burst in the moment I did. The door creaked open. The hallway outside was empty. Nothing. No one. Just the dim flicker of the overhead light at the far end of the corridor, casting a long shadow that stretched unnervingly toward me. The air in the hallway was thick with that same oppressive weight. I felt like I was being watched, though I saw no one. No one moving, no footsteps, no figures lurking in the corners. The silence was overwhelming, but there was something else, something off. The moment I opened the door, the air changed. The once dry atmosphere in the room was now damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and mildew. It wasn't just the smell of a poorly kept hotel. It was something older, deeper, like the building itself had been soaked in decay for years. My throat tightened as I inhaled the musty air, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the kind of smell that only lingered after something terrible had happened. I stepped forward into the hallway, peering into the darkness. The faint sound of my breath and the slow creak of the door behind me were the only things I could hear. I stepped out further, but my body felt heavy, like I was walking through thick molasses. The air around me seemed to hold me in place, wrapping around me, pressing down on me. The hallway stretched farther than I remembered. The walls seemed to close in. The further I walked, the darkness pooling in the corners, almost like the hotel itself was alive, watching me, breathing with me. I glanced back at my room, the door still ajar behind me. The flickering light from the hallway seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, as though it were reacting to my every movement. I turned back to face the darkness ahead, my steps becoming more hesitant. Suddenly I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere down the hall. It wasn't footsteps, not like anyone was walking. It was a slow, shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited, straining to hear any other sound, but the dragging noise stopped as quickly as it had started. My mind raced. It had to be the wind or the house settling again, but the heavy silence that followed told me otherwise. The air felt charged, thick with expectation. I turned back toward my room, ready to retreat into the safety of its walls, but then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just past the flickering light, I saw something move. A shadow, a shape. It was so quick, so fleeting, I could barely make it out. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know if I had imagined it or if it was something more. But the longer I stood there, staring into the dark, the more I was convinced I had seen something, someone. The shadow moved again, this time more deliberate, more noticeable. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shape was too defined. I could almost make out a figure, tall with the faint outline of a head and shoulders. My blood ran cold. Whoever or whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. It was out of place. It didn't belong. I wanted to call out, to shout at whoever was lurking in the dark, but my voice felt caught in my throat. Instead, I turned and bolted back into my room, slamming the door behind me. The sound of the door echoing shut felt too loud, too final, and the room felt even smaller now, even more suffocating. The walls seemed to press in on me, the air growing colder, thicker. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What had I just seen? It couldn't have been real. It had to be a figment of my imagination, the result of too much isolation, too much exhaustion. But the air still smelled damp, still felt heavy with mildew. And in the back of my mind, something whispered to me, something I couldn't shake. You're not alone. The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't know whether it was a heartbeat or a death knell, but the rhythm of the knock seemed to carry with it a finality I couldn't ignore. They were softer now, as if whatever had been outside was retreating into the shadows, waiting for me to make the next move. I stood there frozen, staring at the door, unable to tear my eyes away from the handle. My breath quickened, my chest tightening as the seconds stretched on, agonizingly slow. I thought about opening it again, but I knew that was foolish. The first time I opened the door, nothing was there. But I had seen something, heard something. That figure in the hallway wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a trick of the light or the house settling. It was real. And whatever it was still out there, waiting. I backed away from the door, my legs weak, and I found myself in the far corner of the room, my back pressed against the wall. I wanted to leave, to run out of that hotel, but something held me in place. The same feeling that had settled in my chest the moment I stepped inside. The feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, watching me, had only grown stronger. The knocking continued, relentless. Each tap seemed to punctuate the growing tension in the air, pushing me closer to the edge. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I couldn't escape it. The walls of the room were closing in. I felt a strange compulsion to open the door again. But this time, something inside me whispered, "Don't." And I listened. Lying in bed, I tried to ignore the growing unease that had been creeping up on me since the moment I arrived. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the lamp that flickered intermittently, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The air was thick, the smell of mildew still hanging heavily in the corners of the room. My mind raced, jumping from one thought to the next. Was it the exhaustion? Was I just imagining things? Surely this old hotel, with its creaking floors and stale air, was just playing tricks on my tired mind. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin as I stared into the darkness, hoping sleep would come and free me from the creeping sense of dread. I closed my eyes, trying to quiet my thoughts. But instead of sleep, I heard it. At first it was so faint, I thought it might have been the wind, or perhaps the sound of the hotel settling. But then it came again, a low, unintelligible murmur. I froze, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building. No, this was something else, something alive. The whispering seemed to come from all around me, seeping through the walls, the floorboards, and the ceiling. It felt as though the hotel itself was breathing, alive with secret voices that I wasn't meant to hear. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me had grown colder, the temperature dropping with an unnatural chill that settled deep into my bones. I listened, my eyes darting around the room, trying to pinpoint where the voices were coming from. But there was nothing, nothing visible, nothing tangible. Yet the voices continued, growing louder, rising from the walls in a soft, frenzied cadence. I couldn't make out any of the words. It wasn't clear, not at first, just fragmented sentences and hushed tones that felt like they were speaking directly to me, slipping past my consciousness like a bad memory I couldn't recall. The voices were so close now, as if they were just behind the walls, just inches from me. I strained to hear, but the words were indecipherable, frantic, desperate, like they were arguing. The more I tried to understand, the more I felt my mind becoming tangled, caught in the web of voices that seemed to swirl around me. There were at least two, maybe three voices, and they didn't sound human, not entirely. There was a coldness to them, a rasping, unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. One was higher-pitched, almost childlike, but laced with an underlying malice. The other was deeper, rougher, like the sound of someone trying to whisper through a mouthful of something thick. And the third sounded like a woman's voice, strained and fearful, almost pleading. I couldn't make sense of it. It felt as though the walls themselves were alive, holding some kind of desperate conversation, an argument about something I wasn't supposed to hear. My stomach twisted into knots as I tried to ignore the feeling that they were speaking about me. "You shouldn't be here," one of them seemed to say, though I couldn't understand the full sentence. The voices continued to grow louder, more insistent, more frantic, until they seemed to fill the entire room. I clutched the blanket tighter, my fingers digging into the fabric. The air around me felt heavier, suffocating, and I found it hard to breathe. It was as though the hotel's very foundation was alive, its creaking bones stretching and groaning under the weight of something ancient. I wanted to scream out, to demand that they stop, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry and my pulse was racing. I felt trapped in this room, in this nightmare of whispers and shadows, with no escape. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, unnatural, like the calm before a storm. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know if I could trust my own senses. And then it came, a single voice, guttural and deep, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to speak. It wasn't a whisper. No, this was something far more distinct, far more terrifying. The words rumbled from the walls like a growl, an unnatural sound that sent ice running through my veins. "Leave now." The voice was so clear, so forceful, that I felt it in my chest, vibrating, through my ribs. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, a warning. I froze, my heart slamming against my chest as my eyes darted around the room. I couldn't see anything. There was nothing there, nothing that could explain where that voice had come from. The air was still. The room was still. But I wasn't alone. I had no idea how long I sat there, paralyzed in the dark, listening to the silence that had replaced the voices. The words "leave" now echoed in my mind, over and over, as though they were branded into my brain. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The hotel felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, as if it had grown more aware of me, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. My eyes kept darting around the room, unwilling to look away from the walls as though they might start speaking again. I glanced at the door, locked. The windows shut tight. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to escape. And yet something urged me to leave. That voice, that presence was still, lingering in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake it. I knew I should leave, that whatever was in this hotel wasn't something I could handle, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body rooted to the spot by some unseen force. I glanced toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't closed it properly when I had walked in earlier. The shadows behind it seemed to shift, but I could never focus long enough to catch what might be lurking there. I thought I saw something move, but when I blinked, it was gone. I felt something stir deep inside my gut, an unease that grew, intensifying with every second I spent in that room. Forcing myself to stand, I made my way to the bathroom, my heart racing with each step. I pushed the door open, expecting to find nothing but the dim light flickering above the sink. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't me. Not completely. My eyes were wider than they should have been, darker, sunken, as if someone had drained the life out of me. My face was gaunt, hollow, like I hadn't slept in days, weeks, maybe longer. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the cool glass, but the reflection stayed still. It didn't mirror my movements. It was as though I was looking at a different version of myself, one that didn't belong in this world, a version of me that had been corrupted. I spun away from the mirror, the cold chill of panic crawling up my spine. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I stumbled back into the room, desperate to leave, desperate to escape. But when I reached for the door, the walls seemed to shift, to move, as though they were closing in on me. The air became heavier, thicker, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest constricted as the walls seemed to grow closer, the space shrinking around me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't leave. The voice echoed in my mind once again. Leave now. I staggered, back, my legs trembling, my head spinning with dizziness. The room seemed to be pulsing with a life of its own. The whispers returned, this time louder, sharper, and they surrounded me, wrapping around me like a vice. I couldn't hear what they were saying anymore, but I felt their words deep in my bones, urging me to leave, to get out, to run. The whispers became a cacophony, blending together into an unintelligible roar. My thoughts were consumed by the sound, by the overwhelming pressure of it. I had to leave. I had no choice. With a desperate cry, I bolted for the door. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I didn't care about the voices, the shadows, or the feeling of something watching me from the dark corners of the room. I just had to get out. But when I grabbed the doorknob, I froze. It was already open. I needed to clear my mind. The whispers, the shadows, and the thick, suffocating air in the room were getting to me. I felt like I was being smothered in that small, oppressive space. It felt like I was losing time, like the hours were bleeding together, the weight of the silence pressing on me from every corner. My thoughts were muddled and strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was watching me, as though it had somehow become aware of my presence. I decided to leave the room. A walk would help, maybe. The hallway outside my door felt like a thin sliver of freedom, stretching far too long before it broke into the lobby. I moved quickly, too quickly, trying to escape the heavy air and the suffocating quiet of the room behind me. I needed to see something real, something outside the suffocating walls of the hotel. I told myself I would just take a few laps around the lobby. Nothing too much. It would distract me from the mounting fear, the growing sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. As I made my way downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have. I passed the same doors I'd walked past earlier, but the hallway felt different now, like it was somehow twisted. The walls seemed to press in closer, the space narrowing. The flickering overhead lights did nothing to ease the eerie atmosphere. My shoes clicked sharply against the old floorboards, the sound far too loud in the stillness. When I reached the lobby, I was immediately struck by the strange atmosphere. It felt frozen in time, like a museum of the past. The furniture was old, worn out from years of use, and the carpeting was thick, faded with age. It all seemed to be preserved, but it didn't feel lived in. No, it felt forgotten, abandoned in the most unsettling way. The air had the faintest smell of dust and something else, something I couldn't place. It smelled like the past, like memories long forgotten. What caught my attention were the portraits. There were several of them, hanging on the walls of the lobby, each one in an ornate, dark wood frame that seemed to draw attention with their aged elegance. They depicted old guests of the hotel, their faces frozen in time, staring out from the canvas with eyes that seemed to follow me as I walked past. Each portrait had its own eerie presence. None of them smiled. They looked serious, even grim, as if they were captured in some moment of solemnity or deep thought. I paused in front of one of the larger portraits, my gaze fixed on the figure in the center. It was of a man, probably in his late 40s, with dark, neatly combed hair and a stern, almost unnerving expression on his face. His eyes. His eyes were the kind that seemed to know too much, like he had seen something in his life that no one should ever have to witness. I felt my chest tighten as I stood there, staring at him. His eyes didn't just stare at me. They seemed to see me in a way that made my skin prickle. I tried to shake off the growing discomfort and took a step back, glancing at the other portraits. As I did, I swore I saw something. Just a flicker of movement. The man's eyes, they shifted, just slightly, barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking it. They followed me, tracking my every move as I took another step back. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. I couldn't look away. I blinked, then blinked again, trying to clear my vision, but the feeling didn't go away. I stared at the man in the portrait, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, some weird reflection from the chandelier above. But no, I was certain. His eyes followed me, almost imperceptibly, as though he was alive, watching, aware of my presence. I turned quickly, not wanting to stay in front of the portrait any longer, but as I walked past it, a chill ran down my spine. The other portraits seemed to be watching me now too, their eyes shifting ever so slightly as if they were all aware of my movement, tracking my every step. The feeling of being watched intensified, growing more suffocating with each passing second. I found myself staring at the other faces on the wall, mostly women dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. They were too still, too perfect, almost as if they were all trapped in the same moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all waiting for something, watching for something. But what? I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I was tired, worn down by the strange atmosphere of the hotel, the lack of sleep, the oddness of the place. I forced myself to take a deep breath and move toward the far side of the lobby, trying to leave the unsettling portraits behind me. But as I did, something made me stop. I turned back. I wasn't sure what it was that made me look, but something tugged at me, something pulling me back toward the wall of portraits. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was. One of the portraits to the far left seemed different. The woman in the painting, who had once been framed in a quiet, somber gaze, now had her eyes open. She had never looked that way before. I was certain of it. Her eyes, wide and filled with some dark emotion, seemed to be staring directly at me now. Her gaze wasn't just following me, it was focused. Her mouth was slightly parted, as if she was about to speak. The tension in my chest tightened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I quickly turned away again, feeling my pulse quicken. I didn't want to linger. I wanted to leave the room, to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the floor was pulling me back toward the portraits. I glanced at the other frames, feeling a deep sense of unease building inside me. I couldn't quite understand it, but I knew I had to get away from those eyes. But then I heard it, a soft sound, a whisper. It came from the direction of the portraits, faint at first, like the rustling of fabric, but then it grew clearer. Words. The voice was distant and soft, almost a breath. My heart hammered in my chest as I strained to hear it. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. I could feel the weight of those words pressing on me, and I froze. The air grew thick again, the oppressive feeling from earlier returning. My body tensed. I couldn't move. The voice was so close now, so clear, that I felt like it was coming from right behind me, like the person was standing just over my shoulder. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The woman's eyes in the portrait were still fixed on me, but now there was a faint smile tugging at her lips, a smile that wasn't kind. It was too wide, too knowing, as if she had been waiting for me to turn around. The other portraits, too, now seemed to be subtly shifting, their faces twisted in ways that made me question whether I had seen them that way before. I stumbled back, my feet moving before I could think, my eyes fixed on the portraits as I moved toward the door. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, like it was closing in, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could hear them now, multiple voices overlapping, murmuring incessantly. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, my breath shallow as I pressed my hand against the cool wood. Just as I was about to pull it open, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable. Leave! I whipped around, but the portraits were now still. Silent. The woman's smile had vanished, and the eyes that had followed me were now frozen in place, looking ahead as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen. I yanked the door open and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling that something was following me, that something was still watching, stayed with me as I rushed back to my room. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath ragged, my mind reeling with the images of those portraits and the chilling words I had heard. The hotel had changed. The walls, the portraits, the very air. It was all part of something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. Something that had been waiting, watching, and I was trapped inside it. The hotel had grown eerily quiet after the unsettling encounter with the portraits. I had returned to my room shaking, but I told myself I needed to sleep, that it was all just a bad dream, that I was being foolish. I had come here for peace and quiet, not to fall prey to my own nerves. But the room felt different now, heavier somehow, the air thick with a quiet that was suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the weight of those portraits, their eyes following me. There, mouths whispering things I didn't want to hear. I tried to push it all out of my mind as I settled back onto the bed, wrapping myself tightly in the thin blanket. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence in the hotel was almost oppressive, like a thick fog that pressed down on me. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something out there, just beyond the walls, waiting for me to slip up. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I couldn't focus. And then it started. At first it was subtle, just a small sound that barely registered in my tired brain. A soft tap. I paused, blinking, thinking it might be a car passing outside, a distant sound of something far away. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. The faint sound of footsteps. I froze. I knew I was the only one on this floor. The receptionist had told me that when I checked in. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since my arrival, and it wasn't like I'd missed anyone checking in. The hotel felt abandoned, like it had been left to rot. And yet, now I was hearing footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving directly above me. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my chest tightening as I listened intently, my heart beginning to race. I strained to hear, trying to ignore the sense of dread growing inside me. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps. There was a rhythm to it, as though someone was pacing back and forth in a methodical, almost deliberate manner. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remain calm, but the sound didn't stop. It continued, tapping across the floor above me, echoing through the hotel's thin walls. I wanted to call the front desk, ask if anyone else was up here with me, but when I reached for the phone, something felt wrong. The phone sat there, the handset just inches from my fingers, and I realized it wasn't working. The dial tone was absent, replaced by a silence so complete that it felt unnatural. I pressed the buttons again, harder this time, my frustration growing, but nothing. The phone was dead. I sank back onto the bed, the realization creeping in that I was utterly alone. I had heard the receptionist earlier, a faint voice in the back of my mind. She had seemed off. Something about the way she spoke, the way she smiled, had made me feel uneasy. Had she known something I didn't? Had she warned me without actually saying the words? The footsteps above continued, each one louder now, as if someone was getting closer, moving purposefully in the space above my head. The pace quickened, an uneven shuffle that scraped against the floorboards like nails on a chalkboard. I turned my head toward the ceiling, listening, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air thick and suffocating. My heart hammered in my chest, thudding loudly against my ribs. I thought about leaving, getting up and fleeing the hotel. Entirely. But the sound of footsteps from above kept me rooted to the bed. I couldn't move. I didn't know why, but something about the pacing, the rhythm, was wrong. It didn't sound like an accident. It was as though whoever was up there knew exactly what they were doing. And then, just when I thought the footsteps couldn't get any worse, they stopped. Suddenly, there was silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that settles in the bones and makes you wonder if you're imagining everything. I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything. But the silence stretched on, far too long, far too complete. I sat there waiting. My eyes darted to the door, then back to the ceiling. The room seemed to shrink even more, the walls pressing in on me. My heart thudded so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. My body trembled, but not from the cold. No, it was a deep primal fear that I couldn't shake. My instincts screamed at me to get up, to run, to do anything but stay here, in this room, in this hotel. Then I heard it, a thump. It came from directly above me, a soft, muffled sound like something heavy had fallen. I sat up, my eyes wide, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't expected it. I couldn't have expected it. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. The door was still shut, and for some reason, the thought of opening it now felt like a mistake. Whatever was on the other side of that door felt like something I shouldn't face. But the thump above me was too much. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know. My legs felt stiff as I stood, moving slowly, cautiously, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I crept to the door, my mind racing with fear. There was something in this hotel, something wrong, something that had never left. But I couldn't escape, not yet. The feeling of being watched, of being followed by unseen eyes hung in the air, like a suffocating fog. I pressed my ear to the door listening. The hotel was quiet again, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it all. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but then I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, pacing. But this time, they weren't coming from above. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, my eyes searching the dimly lit room for any sign of movement. The room was empty, nothing out of place, nothing moving. I felt a sharp spike of panic rise in my chest as I took a step back, my gaze darting from the window to the bathroom door to the dark corners of the room. But there was nothing, only the cold, suffocating silence. Then the footsteps continued, no longer above me, but just out of sight. I felt them, heard them, as though they were walking across the floor, right next to me, inching closer, but never showing themselves. I couldn't breathe. My throat was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged itself deep in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. And then I heard it again. That same soft thump. This time it was from behind the bathroom door. It was followed by a low, guttural sound, a noise that didn't belong in the hotel, didn't belong in the world. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Leave. I took a step backward, my body trembling, but my legs wouldn't obey. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows stretching, twisting, pulling at the edges of my mind. Sakum felt something, someone moving in the space around me, in the dark corners of the room. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. And then the voice came again, louder this time. Leave! The air around me thickened, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath mist in front of me. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, all around me, in my head, filling my mind with impossible thoughts. Thoughts that made no sense. I didn't know what was happening, what was real, anymore. I finally broke. The door flew open beneath my trembling hands. I bolted from the room, my heart in my throat, not daring to look back. Whatever was behind me, pacing, watching, it was still there, and it was waiting for me to make a move. But all I could do was run. I stood in front of the bathroom sink, staring at the tired, haggard reflection staring back at me. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, the shadows beneath them more prominent than they should have been. I felt a little dizzy from the lack of sleep, from the relentless fear that seemed to crawl under my skin every time I closed my eyes. The pounding in my head refused to stop, a dull throb that matched the rhythm of my heart. I needed to calm down. I told myself that. A shower might help, I thought. The hot water would cleanse me, wash away the tension that had built up from the past few hours. The paranoia, the suffocating silence of the hotel, the strange events that had unfolded. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the hotel was hiding something, or someone. I stripped quickly, the chill of the room seeping into my skin, and stepped into the shower. The water was hot, a comforting burn against my skin. I closed my eyes, letting the water cascade over me, hoping it would numb the mounting anxiety, at least for a few minutes. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt the silence press in on me. There was no sound beyond the rush of water, no hum of distant voices, no cars outside. Just the relentless quiet of the hotel, the same quiet that made my skin crawl when I was in my room alone. I scrubbed my skin, trying to force out the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the bathroom door, waiting for me to slip up. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something moving in the dark corners of the room, something waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to push those thoughts away, telling myself they were just the product of my tired mind. But they wouldn't stop. The sound of the water became deafening, the hot steam fogging the air around me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I turned off the water and stepped out of the shower, pulling the curtain back. The bathroom mirror was directly in front of me, fogged up entirely, the condensation thick enough that I could barely make out my own reflection. I wiped my hand across the mirror, trying to clear some of the fog, but the surface wouldn't clear. It was as if the steam had settled there, clinging to the glass in a way that didn't make sense. I blinked, rubbing my eyes to clear the fog from my vision. But as I stared back at the mirror, something made me freeze. There, written in the condensation, were words. Someone had written in the mist, their handwriting jagged and uneven. The words stood out against the fog, stark and clear. "Get out!" My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the words, unable to look away, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced, my heart hammering in my chest. "Get out!" The words felt like a warning, a demand, a command. They were too clear to be a trick of the light, too deliberate to be anything but a message meant for me. My pulse quickened, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I could feel the air grow thick again, like something was shifting in the room, closing in on me. I wiped at the mirror again, my hands shaking, desperate to clear it, to make sense of what was happening. But the words didn't fade. They lingered, written in the condensation, stubborn and unyielding, as though they had always been there. A heavy silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. A silence that presses against you, heavy and suffocating. I stepped back from the mirror, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. How had this happened? There was no one else in the room. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen anyone. And yet here they were. Those words, a message left just for me. I turned away, my stomach twisting into knots. The mirror seemed to loom in my peripheral vision, the words staring back at me, taunting me with their presence. My heart raced faster now, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. That's when it happened. A cold sensation brushed across my back, soft at first, like the lightest of touches. My skin crawled in response. My body froze. The air around me seemed to freeze too, thick with a presence that I couldn't understand, couldn't grasp. I spun around so quickly that the world around me seemed to blur. My breath caught in my throat as I looked into the bathroom, my eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing. The room was empty. The bathroom door was still closed, the towel rack undisturbed. No one was there. I felt my legs shake as I stepped forward, my heart racing in my chest. I glanced back at the mirror, still fogged up with the strange, haunting message. The words were still there, still clear as day. Get out! I stepped closer to the mirror, my hands trembling, my mind screaming at me to leave. To run, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt like I was trapped in a dream, every movement slow, sluggish, like I was moving through molasses. The fear, the tension, it was overwhelming, like the room was closing in, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I looked closely at my reflection. My face was pale, drained of color, my eyes wide with panic. I didn't look like myself. It felt like I was staring at a stranger, someone trapped in a mirror, unable to escape. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something. My reflection blinked. Not in sync with me, but in a way that felt wrong. A split second after I blinked, my reflection blinked again, its eyes wide as though in shock. The eyes in the mirror widened unnaturally, the whites showing more than normal, like a wild animal caught in the headlights of a car. I could feel the hairs on my neck rise, the sense of wrongness growing stronger. But that wasn't all. As I stood there, staring at the reflection, I saw it shift. Slightly. My reflection, which had been perfectly still just a moment before, moved. It didn't follow my movements. It jerked, like it had a mind of its own, pulling away from me, its mouth opening in a soundless scream, though I didn't hear it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body screamed at me to move, to turn away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. My reflection wasn't me. It wasn't just the blinking. It was its eyes, its expression. Was alive in a way I couldn't explain, twisting and pulling away from me. I felt my legs give way beneath me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my chest tight with panic. My eyes were locked on the mirror. The reflection of me was still there, but now it wasn't me. It was something else. The eyes that stared back at me were wide and filled with terror, like they were begging for help. Begging to be freed from whatever was holding it in that glass. I couldn't take it anymore. With one last burst of strength, I crawled toward the door. My reflection remained frozen in place, its hands reaching out toward me as I turned away, leaving the bathroom and stumbling back into the room. I slammed the door behind me, panting, my hands slick with sweat. I couldn't stop shaking. My head was spinning, and the image of the mirror, the reflection, was burned into my mind. I had to leave. There was no other choice. Whatever was in this hotel, whatever had been watching me, had followed me into the bathroom. I had seen it with my own eyes. I didn't care how far I had to run. I wasn't staying here. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't let it trap me. The hotel was alive. Something twisted had taken root here, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my things, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran for the door. The hotel had no intention of letting me go. Panic had set in like a wave crashing over me, relentless and unforgiving. Every muscle in my body was tense, every instinct screaming for me to leave, to run as fast as I could, to escape whatever it was that had taken hold of this hotel. The shadows, the whispers, the strange occurrences. They had all been warning signs, signs I should have listened to from the start. But now it was too late for that. Whatever force was pulling at me, whatever was creeping through these walls had already marked me. I grabbed my things, my suitcase, my backpack, rushing through the motions, not bothering to pack carefully. I just wanted out. I didn't care about the clothes I had strewn across the bed, the things I'd left behind. I needed to leave before whatever had been watching me caught up. I didn't even think about going to the front desk to check out. The thought of that woman, the receptionist, her strange smile from earlier, her eyes glinting with something dark and knowing, it made my skin crawl. No, I couldn't go back there. I couldn't risk it. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my belongings into the bag, fumbling with the zipper. Every sound in the room was amplified, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the fabric, every thud of my heartbeat in my chest. The air felt thick again, heavy with the same suffocating presence that had been with me since I first walked into this hotel. It was like the place was alive, like the very walls were closing in on me, pressing me deeper into its grasp. I finally managed to get the door open, and I rushed into the hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air out here was no better, the silence just as stifling. I could feel the weight of the building around me, the oppressive stillness that had settled over the entire hotel. My steps echoed in the hallway, and for a moment it felt like I wasn't moving at all. Time had slowed, and the world outside seemed to fade away. I was alone in a place that wasn't quite real anymore, caught in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I turned the corner, heading toward the stairs, my mind racing with plans to get to the front door, to get out of here and never look back. I didn't care if I had to walk across the highway at this point. I just needed to be away from this place. But as I rounded the corner, I saw her, the receptionist. She was standing there, her figure barely visible in the dim light. But I could feel her presence before I even saw her face. The coldness of her stare reached out, wrapping around me like ice. The same smile I had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something else, something darker. Her eyes were wide now, almost panicked, and she looked at me like she recognized something I didn't understand. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice eerily calm, despite the fear that seemed to pulse behind her gaze. I stopped dead in my tracks, my feet suddenly rooted to the floor. Her presence felt like a weight on my chest, like her gaze was pressing me back into the hotel, pulling me toward her with an invisible force. My throat tightened, and I tried to speak, to ask her what was going on, but the words stuck. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe an explanation, maybe some kind of comfort. But as I opened my mouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't here to help me. She wasn't here to let me leave. "It's already too late for you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I froze. Her words hung in the air, thick, with dread. A part of me wanted to argue, to deny whatever she was saying, but I could feel it, could feel the truth in her words like a weight pressing against me. I was already too late. The hotel had already marked me, had already started pulling me deeper into its darkness, and no matter how much I tried to run, it wouldn't let me go. I took a step back, my mind racing with panic, but before I could turn and run, something happened. The hallway, the very hallway I had just stepped into, seemed to stretch out, growing impossibly long. The walls felt like they were moving, shifting, the shadows pressing in on me, growing thicker and darker with every step I took. The door behind me seemed so far away now, like the space between us had doubled, then tripled. The hallway that had once been manageable, once been a clear path to escape, was now a never-ending maze, its turns twisting in ways I couldn't understand. I spun back toward her, but she wasn't just standing there anymore. She was gone, vanished, as though she had never been there at all. But I could still feel her presence, a cold, malicious weight in the air that hung between me and the door, between me and freedom. The walls around me seemed to press closer, the hotel's grip tightening around my chest, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't going to make it out. I tried to move forward again, but no matter how many steps I took, I didn't get any closer to the end of the hallway. The door to the outside, the door that had seemed like my salvation, was further away than ever, a distant glimmer of light that taunted me with its unreachable promise. The hotel, it seemed, was alive, and it had no intention of letting me go. I turned to the door behind me again, thinking maybe I could go back to my room, lock myself in, hide away from whatever this place was becoming. But as I looked over my shoulder, I saw it. The door slammed shut with a violent bang, the sound echoing down the corridor like a gunshot. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was still empty. The door had closed on its own. The hallway was now completely sealed, and I realized with a jolt of horror that I was trapped. I stepped backward, my legs trembling beneath me, my hands reaching out to steady myself against the walls. But they felt wrong, warped, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The shadows were deeper now, pulling at the edges of my vision. The walls seemed to stretch, twisting in ways they shouldn't, bending in ways that made no sense. I was no longer in the same hotel. This was something else, something that existed outside of time, outside of reason. The floor beneath me felt uneven, and as I took another step, the hallway seemed to twist again, stretching further and further. It was like the hotel itself was alive, and it had decided I would never leave. The panic reached a fever pitch in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. The hallway stretched on, its length impossible, its turns endless. I was caught in the web of the hotel, and there was no way out. And then I saw it, a figure at the far end of the hallway. It was just a shadow at first, indistinct, but as I strained my eyes, I could make out the shape of a person, tall, looming, standing perfectly still in the distance. I couldn't see its face, but could feel its gaze on me. The air grew colder as the figure remained motionless, and I knew without a doubt that it was waiting for me. The hotel had no intention of letting me go. With a sudden, unexplainable surge of terror, I ran. I don't know why I thought I could outrun it, why I thought I could escape this place. But I ran, my footsteps echoing in the ever-darkening hallway, my breath ragged, the walls closing in around me. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, still as death, watching me as I ran, as I was drawn deeper into the endless stretch of the hallway. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself to the limits of my strength, I couldn't escape it. The hallway seemed to grow longer, the air heavier, and the door I had seen, the one I had thought was my salvation, was now nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed by the darkness. I was trapped,